On the night of August 12, 1863, in Savannah, Georgia, 5 members of one of the wealthiest families in the South died screaming in agony at their own dinner table. The poison that killed them was administered by Elizabeth, a 32-year-old enslaved woman who had spent 15 years as both property and secret lover of Master Richard Ashford. By dawn, Magnolia Grove Plantation was ashes. By week's end, Elizabeth and her 3 mixed-race children had vanished into Union territory. The Confederacy called it murder. History calls it something else entirely, but this story doesn't begin with poison. It begins 15 years earlier, when a 17-year-old girl arrived in chains and forever changed the fate of everyone at Magnolia Grove. Summer 1848, Chatham County, Georgia. The air hung thick with humidity and the sickly sweet smell of magnolia blossoms that gave the plantation its name. Magnolia Grove stretched across 2,400 acres of prime cotton land, worked by 147 enslaved people who produced 400 bales annually, a fortune that made Richard Ashford one of the wealthiest men in Savannah society. The plantation itself was a monument to Southern prosperity built on black suffering. The big house rose 3 stories, white columns gleaming in the Georgia sun, surrounded by manicured gardens where oleander and azaleas bloomed in carefully tended rows. Behind it, the slave quarters stretched in 2 long rows of weathered cabins, each housing 6 to 8 people in spaces barely larger than horse stalls. Between the big house and the quarters stood the cotton gin, the blacksmith shop, the smokehouse, the kitchen building, all the machinery of an enterprise that turned human misery into profit. Richard Ashford, at 35 years old, was everything a plantation master was supposed to be. Tall, with dark hair graying at the temples, educated at the College of William and Mary, member of the Savannah Elite Society, deacon at First Presbyterian Church. He wore custom-tailored suits from Charleston, smoked Cuban cigars, and spoke eloquently about states' rights and the biblical justification for slavery. To his peers, he was the perfect Southern gentleman. His wife, Constance Beaumont Ashford, was his perfect complement. Daughter of a Charleston shipping magnate, raised in the finest finishing schools, trained to run a plantation household with military precision. At 33, she was still beautiful in that brittle, porcelain way of Southern belles, pale skin protected from sun, blonde hair always perfectly arranged, dresses that cost more than most people earned in a year. But there was something cold in her blue eyes, something sharp in the way she spoke to the house slaves, something cruel in how she smiled when ordering punishments. Their marriage was what everyone called suitable. Good bloodlines, compatible fortunes, appropriate social standing. What it wasn't was happy. Constance had failed to produce an heir in 8 years of marriage, a shame she carried like a brand. Richard had a son, Thomas, from his first wife who died in childbirth 20 years ago, but Thomas was a disappointment, cruel, stupid, violent. Richard wanted more children, legitimate heirs who might actually be worth something. Constance wanted laudanum and the escape of society functions where she could pretend her life was what she'd dreamed. Into this cold, beautiful, poisonous world came Elizabeth. She arrived on July 3rd, 1848, purchased at the Savannah slave market for the extraordinary sum of $2,800, 3 times the average price. The trader, a man named Marcus Doyle, who smelled of tobacco and sweat, had acquired her in Virginia from an estate sale. "This one's special," he'd told Richard. "Reads and writes. Trained as a lady's maid, light-skinned, easy on the eyes, worth every penny." What made Elizabeth extraordinary was immediately visible. At 17, she possessed a beauty that stopped conversations. Smooth brown skin the color of honey, large dark eyes that seemed to see everything, high cheekbones, full lips, a graceful way of moving that suggested training far above her station. Her mother had been a house slave in Virginia, her father the master's son, a common story never acknowledged. That mixed heritage had given Elizabeth unusual advantages. She'd been raised in the big house, Taught to read by the master's daughters, illegally, but they'd found it amusing. Trained in service that required intelligence and discretion, but beauty and literacy weren't what made Elizabeth special. It was something else, something harder to define, a dignity that slavery hadn't broken, an intelligence that showed in her eyes, even when she kept them downcast, a survival instinct that had kept her alive through 17 years of a system designed to destroy her humanity. Richard saw all of this in the first 5 minutes of examining his new purchase. He saw something else, too, something that would doom them both. Constance, inspecting Elizabeth with the critical eye she used for horseflesh, was less impressed. "She's too pretty," she said flatly. "Pretty slaves cause trouble. The field hands will fight over her. She'll get pregnant and become useless. She'll be your personal maid," Richard said. "Keep her in the big house, away from the others. I already have a maid. Then she'll help in the kitchen. Train as a cook. Someone with her education will be useful." Constance's eyes narrowed. She wasn't stupid. She knew what too pretty meant to men, even men who claimed to be gentlemen. But she also knew there was nothing she could say. Slaves were her husband's property, his to do with as he wished. That was the law. That was the South. "Fine," she said coldly. "But if she causes problems, she goes to the fields." Elizabeth stood silently through this discussion of her fate, eyes downcast, hands folded, face carefully blank. Inside she was cataloguing everything. The way Richard's eyes lingered on her body, the jealousy already hardening Constance's expression, the power dynamics that would define her survival, the invisible chains that were somehow worse than the visible ones she'd just shed. That night, Elizabeth was given a small room off the kitchen, a privilege that immediately set her apart from the other 147 enslaved people who crowded into the quarters. The room was barely 6 feet square, with a narrow cot, a wash basin, and a single window that looked out toward the slave quarters. But it was private. That privacy would become both her sanctuary and her prison. For the first 3 months, Elizabeth's life followed a careful routine. She woke at 5 a.m., prepared breakfast for the family, served at table, cleaned, helped with washing, learned cooking from Martha, the elderly enslaved woman who'd been head cook for 20 years. She kept her eyes down, her voice soft, her movements efficient. She became invisible the way enslaved people learned to become invisible. There but not there, present but not acknowledged, human but not quite. The other enslaved people watched her with a mixture of suspicion and sympathy. Being house slaves didn't make life easier. It made it different, more complicated. You were closer to the family's cruelty, subject to their moods and whims in ways field hands weren't. You heard things, saw things, knew things that could get you killed if you spoke them aloud. Martha, at 60 years old, with grey hair hidden under her head wrap and eyes that had seen too much, took Elizabeth aside after a week. "Child," she said quietly while they kneaded bread dough, "I'm going to tell you something and you're going to listen. Master Ashford got a reputation. Young pretty girls don't last long as house slaves here. You understand what I'm saying?" Elizabeth's hands didn't stop working the dough. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Now, I don't know what you've survived before you came here, but this is different. Master Richard, he ain't like some of them that just take what they want rough and quick. He's worse. He makes you think it's something else. Makes you think you got a choice. Makes you think maybe if you just cooperate, things will be easier. But that's a lie, child. There ain't never a choice for us. What happened to the last girl?" Martha's hands stilled for just a moment. "Her name was Sarah, pretty like you. Master Richard took a shine to her. For a while she got privileges, better food, lighter work, presents. Mistress Constance found out. Had Sarah sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. That was 3 years ago. We heard she died in the fields first summer." Elizabeth absorbed this information silently. It was the story of enslaved women everywhere, caught between masters who saw them as property to exploit and mistresses who saw them as threats to destroy. There was no winning, only surviving if you were smart and lucky. "Thank you for telling me," Elizabeth said quietly. "Ain't about thanks. It's about knowing what's coming, so you ready when it does." What came happened faster than Elizabeth expected. October 15th, 1848. 3 months after her arrival. Richard called her to his study at 10 p.m. After Constance had retired to her room, after the house slaves had been dismissed, after the overseer had finished his final rounds. The study was Richard's private domain, walls lined with books he'd never read, a mahogany desk that cost more than 10 slaves, brandy in crystal decanters, hunting trophies mounted on walls. Elizabeth entered carefully, closing the door behind her as instructed. Richard sat behind his desk, loosening his cravat, brandy glass in hand. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know why I called you here, Elizabeth?" "No, master, don't lie. You're too intelligent to play stupid." Elizabeth's heart was hammering, but her face remained calm. This was the moment Martha had warned her about. The moment every enslaved woman dreaded and knew was inevitable. "You paid a great deal of money for me, master. I assume you want to make use of your investment." Something flickered in Richard's eyes, surprised that she'd spoken so directly, perhaps. Most enslaved women in this situation would cry, beg, pretend submission. Elizabeth's directness was unexpected. "You're very beautiful," he said, "and clearly educated beyond your station. That makes you valuable in ways beyond housework. I understand, master. Do you?" He stood, walked around the desk. "Because I want to be clear. This arrangement can be pleasant for both of us, or it can be unpleasant. The choice is yours." There was the lie Martha had warned her about. The pretense of choice. Elizabeth looked directly at him, a violation of every rule of enslaved conduct, but calculated. "Master, there is no choice. You own me. You can do whatever you wish. If you want me to pretend it's something other than what it is, I can do that. But we both know the truth." Richard's expression shifted, part anger, part fascination. Women of his class would never speak so plainly. Enslaved women usually had more sense than to challenge the fantasy. "You're bold," he said quietly. "I'm honest. Boldness is a privilege I don't have." What happened next would define the next 15 years of Elizabeth's life. Richard could have responded with violence. Many masters would have, faced with such directness. Instead, he did something more dangerous. He became intrigued. "Come here," he said. Elizabeth moved closer, every muscle tense, ready for pain, but Richard didn't strike her. Instead, he poured a second glass of brandy and handed it to her, an act so shocking that Elizabeth almost dropped it. "Slaves didn't drink with masters, ever." "Drink," he said. She did. The brandy burning her throat. "Sit." She sat in the leather chair across from his desk. Another violation. Another impossibility. "Tell me about yourself. Your real self, not the docile slave you pretend to be." And in that moment, Elizabeth made a calculation that would save her life and damn her soul. She began to talk. About Virginia. About her mother, who died when she was 12. About learning to read in secret. About books she'd stolen glances at. About wanting things she could never have. Richard listened, fascinated. He'd never met an enslaved person who spoke like this, with intelligence, with personality, with the complexity of a full human being. It shouldn't have been a revelation, but for men like Richard, raised to see black people as property, it was. That night ended with Richard taking what he'd called her there to take. There was no romance in it, no consent that mattered, but there was also no extreme violence. He'd been almost gentle, as if Elizabeth's humanity, acknowledged for those few minutes of conversation, had required some small adjustment in how he treated her body. Afterward, lying in the dark of her small room, Elizabeth cried silently. Not from physical pain, she'd endured worse in her 17 years, but from the soul-deep understanding that this was now her life. She was trapped in something more complex than simple brutality. She was trapped in a relationship that would require her to perform not just sexual submission, but emotional availability. To pretend, night after night, that this arrangement was somehow more than rape. That Richard's interest in her thoughts made his violation of her body acceptable. The alternative was Sarah's fate, sold to a cotton plantation, worked to death in the Mississippi sun. So Elizabeth made her choice. If she had to survive this, she would survive it on her own terms. She would learn everything, watch everything, Wait for her moment. And when it came, she would take back every piece of herself that Richard Ashford thought he owned. She was 17 years old and had just sentenced herself to 15 years of patient, strategic submission. But she was also the granddaughter of African women who'd survived the Middle Passage, the daughter of a woman who'd endured decades of slavery without breaking. She had intelligence, will, and time. Richard Ashford had just purchased something far more dangerous than a beautiful house slave. He'd purchased his own death. He just didn't know it yet. If you're feeling rage right now, you should. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of enslaved women across the American South, caught between men who claimed to be gentlemen while exploiting the bodies they owned, and women who called themselves Christians while destroying any woman their husbands looked at. This is the America textbooks don't teach, and this is only the beginning of Elizabeth's story. The affair, if such an ugly word can be used for systematic rape disguised as relationship, continued for 15 years. But it evolved in ways that made Elizabeth's captivity even more complex. Within 6 months, Richard had become obsessed. He called her to his study 3-4 times a week. They would talk for hours. About books, about politics, about his frustrations with Constance's coldness and his disappointment in his son Thomas. Richard began to see Elizabeth as something unprecedented in his worldview, an enslaved woman who was also, impossibly, a person. He never acknowledged the fundamental contradiction that you cannot truly know someone you own, cannot truly connect with someone you rape, cannot truly love someone you keep in chains. But Richard convinced himself otherwise. He gave Elizabeth gifts, dresses she could only wear in private, books she had to hide, jewelry she couldn't display. He arranged for her small room to be enlarged, furnished with a real bed and chair. He ensured her workload was lighter than other house slaves. To him, these were acts of affection. To Elizabeth, they were guilt chains. Prettier than iron, but chains nonetheless. The pregnancy happened in April 1849, less than a year after her arrival. Elizabeth knew immediately, felt the changes in her body with a clarity born of dread. Pregnancy for enslaved women meant many things. Loss of value if you were field worker, complicated danger if you were house slave, and absolute disaster if the father was the master. She told Richard one night in his study, watching his face carefully. His reaction was complicated, surprise, something that might have been joy in a different context, then worry. "Are you certain?" "Yes, master. Does anyone else know?" "Not yet." Richard paced, mind working through complications. Constance couldn't know. His wife would demand the child be sold as soon as it was old enough, if not sooner. The other slaves would know, of course. You couldn't hide pregnancy in the quarters. But as long as it stayed whispered rumor and not acknowledged truth, it could be managed. "The child will be mine," Richard said finally. "The child will be a slave, master. By law, no matter the father. I know the law, Elizabeth." His voice had an edge now, irritated at having reality intrude on whatever fantasy he was constructing. "But the child will be treated well. Raised in the big house, educated, protected. Like I'm protected." The bitter truth in her voice made Richard flinch. "I've given you everything I can. You've given me nothing. You own me. Everything I have is yours because I am yours. Even this child, your child, will be your property. That's what you've given me, master. The privilege of bearing children who will be slaves." Richard had no answer to that, because it was truth, stark and undeniable. Martha was the first to notice Elizabeth's changing body. The elderly cook said nothing directly, but started leaving ginger tea in Elizabeth's room for the morning sickness. The other house slaves noticed too. Whispers followed Elizabeth through her work, not unkind but pitying. Another master's bastard, another enslaved child, to be raised in the shadow of illegitimacy. Constance remained oblivious, lost in her own world of laudanum and social calls. The baby was born in December 1849, a girl, with Elizabeth's brown skin slightly lightened, Richard's features visible in the shape of her face. Elizabeth named her Grace after her own dead mother. Richard held the baby once, late at night in Elizabeth's room, something soft crossing his features. Then he left, and reality reasserted itself. Grace was a slave, property, an asset on the plantation's inventory, valued at 100 as an infant. But true to his word, Richard gave orders. Grace would be raised in the big house, trained as a house servant, given privileges. The child would live in Elizabeth's enlarged room, be fed well, be kept from the brutality of field work. It was the best Elizabeth could hope for. It was also a new chain. Now she had a child to protect, a hostage to her cooperation. The second child came in 1851. A boy this time, lighter skinned than Grace, more obviously mixed. Elizabeth named him Daniel, after the biblical figure who survived the lion's den through faith and strategy. Richard was pleased with a son, even a son who could never bear his name legally. The third and final child arrived in 1854. Another girl, whom Elizabeth named Sarah, after the slave woman who'd been sold to Mississippi, the woman whose fate Elizabeth had been meant to share. It was Elizabeth's private memorial, her way of remembering that this comfortable captivity was still captivity. By 1855, Elizabeth had 3 children between ages 2 and 6, all living in her rooms, all raised in the strange liminal space between slave and family. Richard visited them often, brought toys and books, taught Daniel to read himself. To anyone watching, it might have looked almost domestic, a father spending time with children, but they weren't his children legally. They were his property. The same law that let Richard rape Elizabeth with impunity ensured that Grace, Daniel, and Sarah belonged to him as surely as the horses in his stable. The other enslaved people at Magnolia Grove watched this situation with complex emotions. Some pitied Elizabeth, sold to a master's bed, trapped by her own children. Some envied her, living in the big house, eating better food. Her children spared the whip. Some judged her, a bedwench who'd gotten comfortable. None of them fully understood the psychological torture of Elizabeth's position, because few had experienced it. Forced to perform affection for the man who raped you, forced to raise children who were simultaneously yours and his property, forced to watch those children call you Mama while calling him nothing because they couldn't call him father. Moses, the plantation blacksmith, was one of the few who understood. He was 32, strong as the iron he worked, intelligent and watchful. He and Elizabeth had become friends in those early months before Richard claimed her. Conversations stolen in the kitchen, brief moments of connection between two people trying to survive. Moses had loved her, maybe still did. Though he'd never spoken it aloud after she became Richard's, he'd also become Grace's true father figure, teaching the little girl about metalwork when she visited his shop, making toys for all 3 children, offering Elizabeth the one thing Richard never could: respect without possession. In 1857, Constance finally demanded answers. She'd lived with whispered rumors for 8 years, ignored the increasingly obvious truth of 3 mixed-race children living in her house, trained as servants, but clearly special. But patience has limits, even for denial. She confronted Richard one evening after supper, her voice sharp with laudanum courage and 8 years of accumulated rage. Those children, the mulatto children in the East Wing, they're yours. It wasn't a question. Richard, caught off guard, tried deflection. They're house servants, Constance. Children of... Don't lie to me. Her voice rose to a shrill pitch. I'm barren, not blind. That girl, Elizabeth, the one you call to your study every night you think I don't notice, she's your whore, and those children are your bastards. Say it. Richard's face hardened. What's your tone? My tone? My tone? I am your wife. Your legitimate wife. And you've humiliated me for 8 years with that. That slave. Everyone knows. The neighbors whisper. The other slaves mock me. And you dare tell me to watch my tone? What happened next? Elizabeth heard from the hallway outside, where she stood frozen with terror. The sound of Constance's palm striking Richard's face. A moment of stunned silence. Then Richard's voice, low and dangerous. You will never do that again. Or what? You'll sell me like you do your slaves. I have rights, Richard. She doesn't. Those children don't. They're property. Your property. And if you had any decency, any respect for me, for our marriage, for your reputation, you'd sell them all. Today, no, no. Constance laughed bitterly. You're choosing them over me. I'm choosing not to discuss my business decisions with you. The children stay. Elizabeth stays. And if you want to remain the mistress of this house, you'll accept it. The threat was clear. Richard could make Constance's life unbearable without ever breaking the law. Could cut off her access to money, to society, to the laudanum she depended on. Could humiliate her publicly. She had power in this marriage, but he had more. Constance's voice dropped to something cold and calculated. Very well, they stay. But hear this, Richard Ashford. When you die, and you will die someday, the first thing I will do is sell that whore and those mongrel children to the cruelest master I can find. I will ensure they suffer every day for the humiliation you've caused me. That's my promise. Silence. Then, Richard, I'll outlive you, Constance. Jumped on it. We'll see. Elizabeth, listening outside, felt ice form in her stomach. This was no longer just about survival. Constance now openly wanted her destroyed. And if Richard died first, from illness, accident, or age, Constance would have the legal power to do exactly what she'd threatened. Elizabeth had to protect her children, which meant she had to outlive Constance, or ensure Constance didn't outlive Richard, or the thought formed slowly, terribly, ensure they all died before they could sell her family to hell. That was the night Elizabeth first seriously considered murder. She was 26 years old, mother of 3, trapped in a nightmare with no legal escape. The Fugitive Slave Act meant running north was nearly impossible with children. The war everyone whispered about, between North and South over slavery, might never come. And even if it did, Confederate Georgia would fight to keep slavery long past Elizabeth's ability to protect her children. Murder seemed impossible. She was constantly watched, always suspected. Constance now regarded her with open hatred. Richard might protect Elizabeth from being sold, but he wouldn't protect her from execution if she was caught poisoning his wife. So Elizabeth waited, watched, learned. She memorized the household routines. She studied the oleander plants in Constance's garden, the foxglove in the decorative beds, the jimson weed growing wild at the plantation's edges. She listened when Dr. Whitmore visited, discussing dosages of medicines. She observed which family members visited, who was cruel to slaves, who might be a threat. She taught her children to read and write in secret, the same way she'd learned. She told them stories from the Bible about Moses leading his people to freedom, about David defeating Goliath, about Esther saving her people through strategic courage. She prepared them for a world where they would need to be smarter, stronger, and more careful than everyone around them, and she waited for her moment. It came in the summer of 1863, 15 years after Elizabeth first arrived at Magnolia Grove. The Civil War had been raging for 2 years. Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July had shifted the war's momentum. Sherman's march toward Georgia was inevitable. Everyone knew it, though Confederates tried to pretend otherwise. The South was losing, slowly but certainly. Freedom was coming, but not fast enough for Elizabeth, because on July 18, 1863, Constance made a discovery that would force Elizabeth's hand. Richard had commissioned a portrait of himself with Elizabeth years ago, 1856, when he'd been drunk on the fantasy that this arrangement was somehow love rather than exploitation. A traveling artist from Charleston had painted it secretly, been paid extravagantly for his discretion. The portrait showed Richard and Elizabeth sitting together, her hand in his, all 3 children clustered around them. It looked impossibly like a family portrait, like Elizabeth was his wife and the children legitimate. Richard had hidden it in a locked cabinet in his study, taking it out occasionally to look at it with whatever complicated emotions motivated him. Constance found it while searching for the key to Richard's liquor cabinet. Her scream of rage brought half the house running. Elizabeth, working in the kitchen, heard it and knew immediately that something terrible had happened. She ran toward the study, arriving as Constance emerged with the portrait, her face twisted with fury. "This!" Constance shrieked, holding up the portrait. "This is what you've been hiding. This is your real family, isn't it? Your slave whore and your mongrel bastards. House slaves scattered, sensing violence." Richard emerged from his office, saw the portrait, and went pale. "Constance, calm yourself." "Calm myself! Calm myself! You commissioned a portrait of them, like they're your legitimate family, like I don't exist." She threw the portrait at Richard. It struck him in the chest, frame cracking. "You've humiliated me for the last time. I want them gone. All of them. By tomorrow, Constance. By tomorrow. Or I'll go to the congregation, to your business partners, to everyone in Savannah society, and tell them exactly what you've been doing. I'll destroy your reputation. You'll do no such thing." Richard's voice was suddenly hard, dangerous. "Because if you do, I'll have you committed to an asylum. One conversation with Dr. Whitmore about your laudanum addiction, your hysteria, your instability, and you'll spend the rest of your life in a madhouse. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air between them. Both knew he could do it. Husbands had absolute power to institutionalize wives, especially wives who demonstrated hysteria. But Constance had reached a breaking point where consequences didn't matter anymore. "Then do it," she said coldly. "But if I'm going to an asylum, they're going to hell. I've already sent word to Marcus Doyle, the slave trader. He'll be here tomorrow to purchase them. He specializes in shipping slaves to the worst plantations in Mississippi. Cotton fields where niggers drop dead in months. That's where your whore and her brats are going." "You did what?" "I sent a telegram this morning. He'll arrive tomorrow at noon with cash and chains. And there's nothing you can do to stop it without revealing everything publicly." She was right. If Richard refused to sell, he'd have to explain why. That would confirm all the rumors. His reputation in 1863 Georgia, where public image was everything, would be destroyed. Constance smiled viciously. "Goodbye, Elizabeth. I hope you and your children die screaming in the Mississippi sun." She swept past, leaving Elizabeth standing in the hallway, shaking with terror. Richard turned to Elizabeth, his face anguished. I'll find a way. I won't let." But Elizabeth had heard enough promises from Richard Ashford. 15 years of promises. Promises to protect her. Promises to protect the children. Promises that meant nothing when his reputation was at stake. The other enslaved people at Magnolia Grove watched this situation with complex emotions. Some pitied Elizabeth, sold to a master's bed, trapped by her own children. Some envied her, living in the big house, eating better food. Her children spared the whip. Some judged her, a bedwench who'd gotten comfortable. None of them fully understood the psychological torture of Elizabeth's position, because few had experienced it. Forced to perform affection for the man who raped you. Forced to raise children who were simultaneously yours and his property. Forced to watch those children call you Mama while calling him nothing because they couldn't call him father. Moses, the plantation blacksmith, was one of the few who understood. He was 32, strong as the iron he worked, intelligent and watchful. He and Elizabeth had become friends in those early months before Richard claimed her. Conversations stolen in the kitchen, brief moments of connection between two people trying to survive. Moses had loved her, maybe still did. Though he'd never spoken it aloud after she became Richard's, he'd also become Grace's true father figure, teaching the little girl about metalwork when she visited his shop, making toys for all three children, offering Elizabeth the one thing Richard never could: respect without possession. In 1857, Constance finally demanded answers. She'd lived with whispered rumors for 8 years, ignored the increasingly obvious truth of 3 mixed-race children living in her house, trained as servants, but clearly special. But patience has limits, even for denial. She confronted Richard one evening after supper, her voice sharp with laudanum courage and 8 years of accumulated rage. "Those children, the mulatto children in the East Wing, they're yours." It wasn't a question. Richard, caught off guard, tried deflection. They're house servants, Constance. Children of... Don't lie to me. Her voice rose to a shrill pitch. I'm barren, not blind. That girl, Elizabeth, the one you call to your study every night you think I don't notice, she's your whore, and those children are your bastards. Say it. Richard's face hardened. What's your tone? My tone? My tone? I am your wife. Your legitimate wife. And you've humiliated me for 8 years with that. That slave, everyone knows. The neighbors whisper. The other slaves mock me. And you dare tell me to watch my tone? What happened next? Elizabeth heard from the hallway outside, where she stood frozen with terror. The sound of Constance's palm striking Richard's face. A moment of stunned silence. Then Richard's voice, low and dangerous. You will never do that again. Or what? You'll sell me like you do your slaves. I have rights, Richard. She doesn't. Those children don't. They're property. Your property. And if you had any decency, any respect for me, for our marriage, for your reputation, you'd sell them all. Today, no, no. Constance laughed bitterly. You're choosing them over me. I'm choosing not to discuss my business decisions with you. The children stay. Elizabeth stays. And if you want to remain the mistress of this house, you'll accept it. The threat was clear. Richard could make Constance's life unbearable without ever breaking the law. Could cut off her access to money, to society, to the laudanum she depended on. Could humiliate her publicly. She had power in this marriage, but he had more. Constance's voice dropped to something cold and calculated. Very well, they stay. But hear this, Richard Ashford. When you die, and you will die someday, the first thing I will do is sell that whore and those mongrel children to the cruelest master I can find. I will ensure they suffer every day for the humiliation you've caused me. That's my promise. Silence. Then, Richard, I'll outlive you, Constance. Come on it, we'll see. Elizabeth, listening outside, felt ice form in her stomach. This was no longer just about survival. Constance now openly wanted her destroyed. And if Richard died first, from illness, accident, or age, Constance would have the legal power to do exactly what she'd threatened. Elizabeth had to protect her children, which meant she had to outlive Constance, or ensure Constance didn't outlive Richard. Or the thought formed slowly, terribly, ensure they all died before they could sell her family to hell. That was the night Elizabeth first seriously considered murder. She was 26 years old, mother of 3, trapped in a nightmare with no legal escape. The Fugitive Slave Act meant running north was nearly impossible with children. The war everyone whispered about, between North and South over slavery, might never come. And even if it did, Confederate Georgia would fight to keep slavery long past Elizabeth's ability to protect her children. Murder seemed impossible. She was constantly watched, always suspected. Constance now regarded her with open hatred. Richard might protect Elizabeth from being sold, but he wouldn't protect her from execution if she was caught poisoning his wife. So Elizabeth waited, watched, learned. She memorized the household routines. She studied the oleander plants in Constance's garden, the foxglove in the decorative beds, the Jimson weed growing wild at the plantation's edges. She listened when Dr. Whitmore visited, discussing dosages of medicines. She observed which family members visited, who was cruel to slaves, who might be a threat. She taught her children to read and write in secret, the same way she'd learned. She told them stories from the Bible about Moses leading his people to freedom, about David defeating Goliath, about Esther saving her people through strategic courage. She prepared them for a world where they would need to be smarter, stronger, and more careful than everyone around them, and she waited for her moment. It came in the summer of 1863, 15 years after Elizabeth first arrived at Magnolia Grove. The Civil War had been raging for 2 years. Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July had shifted the war's momentum. Sherman's march toward Georgia was inevitable. Everyone knew it, though Confederates tried to pretend otherwise. The South was losing, slowly but certainly. Freedom was coming, but not fast enough for Elizabeth, because on July 18, 1863, Constance made a discovery that would force Elizabeth's hand. Richard had commissioned a portrait of himself with Elizabeth years ago, 1856, when he'd been drunk on the fantasy that this arrangement was somehow love rather than exploitation. A traveling artist from Charleston had painted it secretly, been paid extravagantly for his discretion. The portrait showed Richard and Elizabeth sitting together, her hand in his, all three children clustered around them. It looked impossibly like a family portrait, like Elizabeth was his wife and the children legitimate. Richard had hidden it in a locked cabinet in his study, taking it out occasionally to look at it with whatever complicated emotions motivated him. Constance found it while searching for the key to Richard's liquor cabinet. Her scream of rage brought half the house running. Elizabeth, working in the kitchen, heard it and knew immediately that something terrible had happened. She ran toward the study, arriving as Constance emerged with the portrait, her face twisted with fury. "This!" Constance shrieked, holding up the portrait. "This is what you've been hiding. This is your real family, isn't it? Your slave whore and your mongrel bastards. House slaves scattered, sensing violence." Richard emerged from his office, saw the portrait, and went pale. "Constance, calm yourself." "Calm myself." "Calm myself. You commissioned a portrait of them, like they're your legitimate family, like I don't exist." She threw the portrait at Richard. It struck him in the chest, frame cracking. "You've humiliated me for the last time. I want them gone. All of them. By tomorrow, Constance. By tomorrow. Or I'll go to the congregation, to your business partners, to everyone in Savannah society, and tell them exactly what you've been doing. I'll destroy your reputation. You'll do no such thing." Richard's voice was suddenly hard, dangerous. "Because if you do, I'll have you committed to an asylum. One conversation with Dr. Whitmore about your laudanum addiction, your hysteria, your instability, and you'll spend the rest of your life in a madhouse. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air between them. Both knew he could do it. Husbands had absolute power to institutionalize wives, especially wives who demonstrated hysteria. But Constance had reached a breaking point where consequences didn't matter anymore. "Then do it," she said coldly. "But if I'm going to an asylum, they're going to hell. I've already sent word to Marcus Doyle, the slave trader. He'll be here tomorrow to purchase them. He specializes in shipping slaves to the worst plantations in Mississippi. Cotton fields where niggers drop dead in months. That's where your whore and her brats are going." "You did what?" "I sent a telegram this morning. He'll arrive tomorrow at noon with cash and chains. And there's nothing you can do to stop it without revealing everything publicly." She was right. If Richard refused to sell, he'd have to explain why. That would confirm all the rumors. His reputation in 1863 Georgia, where public image was everything, would be destroyed. Constance smiled viciously. "Goodbye, Elizabeth. I hope you and your children die screaming in the Mississippi sun." She swept past, leaving Elizabeth standing in the hallway, shaking with terror. Richard turned to Elizabeth, his face anguished. I'll find a way. I won't let..." But Elizabeth had heard enough promises from Richard Ashford. 15 years of promises. Promises to protect her. Promises to protect the children. Promises that meant nothing when his reputation was at stake. Ruth visited on July 21st, ostensibly to check on a pregnant house slave, actually to consult with Elizabeth. The two women spoke in Elizabeth's room, voices barely above whispers. "Moses told me," Ruth said without preamble. "I'm with you. What do you need?" "Blessing," Elizabeth said. "I need to know the ancestors won't abandon me for this." Ruth studied her with ancient eyes. "Child, the ancestors been waiting for this. Every drop of blood spilled in justice tips the scales back toward balance. You think your grandmother, your mother, all those who died in chains, you think they'll judge you for freeing yourself and your babies. I'm committing murder. You're committing survival. There's a difference." Ruth pulled a small cloth bag from her dress, a mojo bag filled with protective herbs and items. "Hide John the Conqueror root for strength. Graveyard dirt for protection from haunting. Sulfur for purification. Red brick dust to confuse enemies. You wear this close to your heart the night you do this. It'll protect you." Elizabeth took the bag, felt its weight. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just succeed. And when you're free, remember those of us who can't run. Moses says you taking anyone who wants to go? Anyone who can move fast and stay quiet. We'll have maybe 2 hours before they realize what happened and form a posse." Ruth nodded. "I'll spread the word careful-like, just the ones who can be trusted." She paused. "You scared?" "Terrified." "Good, means you're smart. But Elizabeth, you're the bravest woman I've known in 68 years. Your children will be free. That's worth any price." After Ruth left, Elizabeth sat with her 3 children and told them a carefully edited version of the truth. "We're leaving," she said simply, "in a few days. We're going north to freedom." Grace, at 13, was old enough to understand the danger. "I can't tell you everything yet. But when the time comes, you'll need to move fast, stay quiet, and trust me completely." "Can you do that?" All 3 nodded, eyes wide. "We'll be free?" Sarah asked, her 9-year-old voice hopeful. "We'll be free," Elizabeth promised. "Or we'll die trying. But we will never be sold, never separated. That I swear." Daniel, 12, and already showing his father's intelligence, asked the difficult question, "What about father?" Elizabeth's throat tightened. Despite everything, the children had some affection for Richard. He'd been kind to them in his way, taught them, brought them gifts. They didn't fully understand that his kindness was built on the foundation of owning them. "Your father made choices," Elizabeth said carefully. "He chose to own us rather than free us. He chose his reputation over our safety. He's not coming with us. Will he try to stop us?" "He won't get the chance." Grace, sharp as her mother, caught the implication. Her eyes widened, but she said nothing, just nodded. The days until August 12th passed in agonizing slow motion. Elizabeth moved through her routines, cooking, cleaning, serving, while her mind catalogued every detail of the upcoming dinner. The menu: roasted duck, sweet potatoes, green beans, cornbread, pecan pie. The wine: Richard's best French Bordeaux, saved for special occasions. The timing: guests would arrive at 6 p.m., dinner served at 7 p.m., multiple courses over 2 hours. The poison would go in the wine sauce for the duck, the main course, served mid-meal. The richness would mask the oleander's bitterness. She'd prepare it fresh in the kitchen, personally carry each plate to the table. No one would question it. She was Richard's trusted cook, had prepared hundreds of meals for the family. Moses, meanwhile, was quietly collecting kerosene, hiding small containers in the big house's crawl spaces, library shelves, Richard's study. On the night of the 12th, he'd distribute them, create multiple fire points. The house was old, dry wood, filled with flammable furniture and fabrics. It would burn fast. Ruth spread the word among trusted slaves. Be ready on the night of August 12th. Pack light. 1 bag per person. Food, water, extra clothes. Meet at the edge of the West Cotton Field at midnight. Anyone who wanted freedom could come. Ruth estimated maybe 15 people would risk it. Mostly young, mostly without small children who'd slow them down. August 12th, 1863, arrived with brutal Georgia heat and cloudless skies. Elizabeth woke at 4 a.m., her heart hammering. This was the day. By this time tomorrow she'd be free or dead. There was no middle ground. She checked on her children, all 3 sleeping fitfully, aware that something momentous was coming. She touched each of their faces, memorizing them in case everything went wrong. Then she went to the kitchen and began preparing the birthday feast that would be the Ashford family's last meal. The duck was perfect. Golden skin, tender meat. The sweet potatoes were caramelized with butter and brown sugar. The cornbread was moist. The green beans seasoned with bacon. Everything was exactly as it should be. The Ashfords would die eating the best meal Elizabeth had ever prepared for them. There was poetry in that. At 5 p.m., Elizabeth prepared the wine reduction sauce for the duck. She worked alone in the kitchen. She'd sent the other house slaves away, claiming she wanted to handle this special meal personally. No witnesses, no one who could testify later. The oleander extract came out of its hiding place, a small vial, innocuous-looking, containing death for 5 people. Elizabeth's hands were steady as she poured it into the dark wine sauce, stirred it carefully, tasted a tiny amount on her finger to verify the bitterness was hidden. It was. The wine and duck fat overpowered everything. She portioned the sauce carefully, equal amounts for each of the 5 main plates. The other dinner guests, 3 of Richard's business associates, would get untainted sauce. This had to look like food poisoning, not targeted murder. Only the family plates would kill. At 6 p.m. guests began arriving. Elizabeth could hear them from the kitchen. Laughter, conversation, birthday wishes for Richard. Thomas Ashford arrived drunk as usual. Margaret, Constance's sister, arrived dripping with jewelry and contempt. Dr. Whitmore arrived with his medical bag, always prepared for emergencies. The irony of that would be sharp in a few hours. At 6:45 p.m., Elizabeth plated the first course, soup. Her hands didn't shake. She was calm, focused, operating on a level beyond fear. This was happening. No turning back. She carried the soup course into the dining room. The table was magnificent. Richard's best china, crystal glasses, silver candlesticks, white linen. 8 people sat around it. Richard at the head, Constance at the foot, Thomas and Margaret on one side, Dr. Whitmore and 3 business associates on the other. Richard smiled at Elizabeth as she served. "It smells wonderful." "Thank you, Master." Her voice was perfectly neutral, perfectly subservient. Constance didn't even look at her. To Constance, Elizabeth was already gone, sold tomorrow, erased from existence. Constance was celebrating tonight. Elizabeth returned to the kitchen, brought out the second course, salad, then the third, bread and butter. All routine, all normal. The dinner conversation was animated, full of talk about the war. Confederates were still confident despite Gettysburg. About cotton prices, about politics. No one noticed Elizabeth's unusual calm. No one questioned why she was serving alone tonight. She was invisible, as enslaved people always were. They saw hands bringing food, not a person planning their deaths. At 7:30 p.m., Elizabeth plated the main course, 5 plates with poisoned sauce, 3 plates with clean sauce. She marked them mentally, knew exactly which plate went to which person. Grace, Daniel, and Sarah were in Elizabeth's room, under strict instructions not to leave until she came for them. Ruth was waiting at the edge of the cotton fields with the 15 people who'd chosen freedom. Moses was in the big house basement, ready with kerosene. Everything was in place. Elizabeth carried the first 2 plates into the dining room. Richard's and Constance's set them down carefully. "This looks exquisite, Elizabeth," Richard said. She didn't respond. Couldn't trust her voice. Back to the kitchen. Thomas's and Margaret's plates, delivered to the table. Finally, Dr. Whitmore's plate, and the 3 clean plates for the business associates, all served, all eating. Elizabeth stood in the corner of the dining room, hands folded, watching, waiting. The conversation continued. Politics, cotton, the war. Forks clinked against china. Wine glasses were refilled. The poisoned 5 ate their duck with wine sauce, savoring it. Richard took a second helping of sauce. "Elizabeth, this is your finest work." "Thank you, Master." 20 minutes passed, 30. Elizabeth's nerves were screaming, but her face remained calm. Then Constance paused mid-sentence. "I feel strange." "Strange how?" Margaret asked. "Dizzy, nauseous." Constance set down her fork. Her face had gone pale. Thomas laughed drunkenly. "Maybe you've had too much wine, Mother." But Richard was also looking ill. "I feel it too. My heart is racing." Dr. Whitmore frowned. Perhaps the duck was... He didn't finish the sentence. His own face had gone grey, sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Something's wrong," Margaret said, her voice rising. "Something's very wrong." The 3 business associates looked alarmed. "Should we call for help?" "I am the help," Dr. Whitmore said, standing shakily. "Everyone who feels ill." Moved to Thomas, suddenly convulsed, his body jerking violently. He fell from his chair, crashing to the floor, limbs spasming. Chaos erupted. Constance screamed. Richard tried to stand, but his legs gave out. Margaret was vomiting into her napkin, eyes rolling back. Dr. Whitmore reached for his medical bag, but his hands were shaking too badly to open it. The 3 business associates jumped up, backing away from the table in horror, and Elizabeth, standing in the corner, felt a strange calm settle over her. This was justice. 15 years compressed into this moment. Richard's eyes found hers across the chaos. In his gaze, she saw understanding dawn, what she'd done, why she'd done it. His mouth opened, but only blood came out. He collapsed face first into his plate. Elizabeth turned and walked out of the dining room. Behind her, 5 people were dying, screaming, convulsing, drowning in their own vomit and blood. The cardiac glycosides in oleander were destroying their hearts, shutting down their nervous systems. It was an agonizing death. Elizabeth felt no pity. She moved quickly through the house to her room. Grace, Daniel, and Sarah were waiting, packed bags at their feet, terror and excitement warring on their faces. "It's time," Elizabeth said, "exactly as we planned, fast and quiet." They moved as a unit through the servants' entrance into the night. Behind them, the screaming had stopped. In front of them, freedom beckoned. Moses met them at the back of the big house, face grim. "It's done, it's done. Then let's finish it." He disappeared into the house. 3 minutes later, smoke began to curl from the windows. 5 minutes after that, flames were visible, orange light flickering through multiple rooms simultaneously. The kerosene Moses had distributed was doing its work. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the dry wood and expensive fabrics. House slaves were emerging from quarters, staring at the inferno in shock. Some ran toward it, trying to help. Others, the ones Ruth had warned, ran the other way, toward the west cotton field where freedom waited. Elizabeth didn't look back. She took her children's hands and ran into the darkness. By the time the Savannah Fire Brigade arrived 3 hours later, Magnolia Grove was ash. They found 5 bodies in the dining room, charred beyond recognition, but identifiable by their positions. The 3 business associates had survived, though they'd fled the house in terror the moment the fire started. By the time the sheriff began investigating, Elizabeth and 18 other people were 20 miles north, moving through the night, toward a Quaker farmhouse where abolitionists would hide them until they could reach Union lines. By the time wanted posters went up, $5,000 for the capture of Elizabeth and her accomplices, they'd crossed into Tennessee. And by the time Marcus Doyle arrived at Magnolia Grove on August 13th to collect his purchases, there was nothing left but ruins and rumors. The Ashford Massacre, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves through Georgia's slave-holding society. 5 wealthy whites dead, an entire plantation destroyed, nearly 20 slaves escaped. It was every slave owner's nightmare made real. Confederate. Authorities formed posses, deployed bloodhounds, searched for months. But Elizabeth had vanished like smoke. If you're wondering how you'd react in that dining room, watching 5 people die by your own hand, remember this. Elizabeth didn't wonder. She'd made her peace with it years before, every time Richard raped her and called it affection. Every time Constance looked through her like she wasn't human, every time Thomas hurt her and faced no consequences, every time Dr. Whitmore measured her children's skulls like they were specimens, they'd killed her spirit 1,000 times. She killed their bodies once. The math seemed fair. The journey to freedom took 6 weeks. Elizabeth, her 3 children, Moses, Ruth, and 15 others, 12 adults, 3 teenagers, moved only at night, slept hidden during the day. They traveled through woods and swamps, avoiding roads where Confederate patrols and slave catchers hunted them. They waded through rivers to throw off bloodhounds. They hid in haylofts, root cellars, abandoned slave cabins. They lived on whatever food abolitionists could spare and whatever they could forage, wild berries, nuts, occasionally a chicken stolen from a farm. The Quaker family in Macon County, the Thompsons, hid them for 3 days, fed them, provided fresh clothes and supplies. Joshua Thompson, a man of 50 with kind eyes and Quaker simplicity, said quietly, "What thou did was the Lord's work. Vengeance is his, and he used thy hands. Go with our blessings." Elizabeth wasn't sure she believed in the Thompsons' God, but she accepted the blessing. From Macon County, they moved northwest toward Chattanooga, where Union forces had taken control. The journey was grueling, 200 miles on foot, most of it through hostile Confederate territory. They lost 2 people along the way. One elderly man died of exhaustion, another was bitten by a snake and died within hours. They buried both in unmarked graves, said prayers Ruth had learned from her African mother, and kept moving. There were close calls. Once they hid in a tobacco barn while Confederate soldiers searched for deserters just 20 feet away. Another time, bloodhounds picked up their scent and they had to split into 3 groups, each running in different directions before reuniting 2 days later. A slave catcher spotted Sarah once and gave chase. Moses killed the man with his bare hands, broke his neck, left his body in a ravine. They didn't speak about it afterward. It was survival, nothing more. On September 29, 1863, they crossed into Union-controlled Tennessee. The moment they saw Union Army pickets, black soldiers recently recruited wearing blue uniforms, Grace started crying. Daniel dropped to his knees. Sarah just stared, unable to process that they'd actually made it. Elizabeth felt something break open in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for 32 years. She was free. Actually, legally, impossibly free. A Union captain, a white man from Massachusetts named Harrison, interviewed them briefly. "You folks escaped from Georgia?" "Yes, sir," Moses answered. "Nearly 20 of us. We walked." "From where?" "Savannah area. Magnolia Grove Plantation." Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "Magnolia Grove, the one that burned, where the whole family was poisoned." Silence. Harrison looked at Elizabeth directly. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Elizabeth met his eyes. "I know that 5 people died. I know that 18 people got free. I know which side of that equation matters to me." Harrison studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled slightly. "Fair enough. As far as I'm concerned, you folks just arrived from Tennessee. No idea about anything happening in Georgia? The Army's got better things to do than send refugees back to slave catchers. You're under Union protection now." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. Thank Lincoln. Emancipation Proclamation freed you back in January, at least in rebel territory. You just had to reach us to claim it." He gestured to a tent camp behind him. "We've got contraband camps set up, freed slaves waiting for war's end. Not fancy, but you'll have food, shelter, safety. And if any of you want to enlist," he looked at Moses, "we're taking volunteers for the colored troops. Pays less than white soldiers, but it's something." Moses enlisted the next day. So did 5 other men from their group. They wanted to fight, to be part of destroying the system that had enslaved them. Elizabeth, Ruth, and the others settled into the contraband camp, a sprawling collection of tents and rough cabins housing thousands of escaped slaves. It was crowded, unsanitary, and the most beautiful place Elizabeth had ever seen, because everyone there was free. The war continued for another 19 months. Elizabeth worked as a laundress for the Union Army, earned wages for the first time in her life. She saved every penny. Grace, Daniel, and Sarah attended school, a real school, taught by Northern abolitionists, where black children learned to read and write openly, without fear. On April 9, 1865, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. The Confederacy was dead. Slavery was dead. When Elizabeth heard the news, she walked to the edge of the camp and wept for an hour straight. Wept for everyone who died in chains, wept for her mother, her grandmother, all the ancestors who'd never lived to see this. Wept for herself, 34 years old, finally free, but scarred so deeply she wasn't sure she'd ever feel whole. Ruth found her there. The elderly woman sat down beside her, joints creaking. "We lived to see it," Ruth said quietly. "Never thought we would." "What do we do now?" Elizabeth asked. "I don't know how to be free. I only know how to survive." "Then you learn, same way you learned everything else. One day at a time." Elizabeth and her family moved to Philadelphia in July 1865, joining a growing community of freed people building new lives. Elizabeth changed her name legally to Elizabeth Freeman, Freeman for the freedom she'd taken for herself. She worked as a seamstress, rented a small house, enrolled her children in integrated schools. Grace, at 14, had survived horrors, but remained bright, determined. She became a teacher, eventually opened a school for black children in Philadelphia. Daniel, at 13, channeled his father's intelligence into study. He attended night classes, eventually became a bookkeeper, and then a businessman, owned his own store. Sarah, at 10, was the most damaged. Nightmares plagued her for years, but she found healing in helping others, became a nurse during the yellow fever epidemic of 1870, saved dozens of lives. Moses survived the war, came to Philadelphia, opened a metalworking shop. He and Elizabeth never married. Their relationship had been forged in shared trauma, and both needed space to heal individually. But they remained close friends until Moses died in 1889 at age 67. Ruth lived to 94, died peacefully, in 1889 surrounded by the community she'd helped build. Elizabeth lived until 1909, 44 years of freedom after 32 years of slavery. She never remarried, never spoke publicly about what she'd done. But in 1899, at age 68, she wrote a detailed confession. The document was sealed with instructions to be opened only after her death. When it was published in 1910, it caused a sensation. The Confession of Elizabeth Freeman. Excerpts. My name was Elizabeth before they owned me. Elizabeth after I freed myself. Between those names lies a story of 32 years in chains and one night of blood that broke them. I murdered 5 people on August 12, 1863. I do not call it anything else. Murder is the correct word. I poisoned them deliberately, watched them die, felt no remorse then, and feel none now as I write this in 1899. Was it justice? Was it revenge? I believe it was both and neither. It was survival dressed in the clothes of vengeance. They called Richard Ashford my master. He called our relationship something softer, affection, perhaps even love. But you cannot love what you own. You cannot have a relationship with your property. Every night he came to me, it was rape, regardless of whether force was necessary. The chains were invisible but absolute. My children, Grace, Daniel, Sarah, were born into slavery because their father owned their mother. That is the ultimate obscenity, to create life and simultaneously own it. Richard thought he was being kind by keeping us together, by educating them. He didn't understand that kindness from an enslaver is like kindness from an executioner. It doesn't change the fundamental reality of power. When Constance threatened to sell my children to a Mississippi cotton plantation, she wasn't being unusually cruel. She was simply exercising her legal rights. That's what makes slavery so monstrous. The legal framework that allows one human to own another, to sell children, to rape without consequence, to destroy families as casually as breaking furniture. I had no legal recourse, no court that would hear my case, no law that protected me. I was property defending property, my children. The only law I could appeal to was natural law, the right of a mother to protect her offspring, the right of a human being to resist absolute evil. So I killed them. And I would do it again. People will judge me. Some will call me a monster. Some will call me a hero. I am neither. I am simply a woman who was pushed beyond endurance and chose to push back. If this confession makes you uncomfortable, good. Slavery should be uncomfortable to remember. Freedom was won in blood. On battlefields, yes, but also in plantation houses where enslaved people took justice into their own hands. I am 78 years old as I write this. I've been free for 44 years. I have grandchildren now, born free, who will never know chains. That is my legacy. Not the 5 people I killed, but the 3 I saved, and all their descendants who will walk free because I chose violence over submission. History will remember the Civil War, the great battles, the famous generals. But there were thousands of smaller wars, fought in darkness by people whose names you'll never know. I'm one of those soldiers. I fought my war with oleander poison and fire. I won, may God forgive me. I do not forgive myself because I do not believe I need forgiveness. I did what was necessary. That is all. The confession was published in abolitionist newspapers, then mainstream press. It sparked fierce debate. Was Elizabeth Freeman a murderer or freedom fighter? Did circumstances justify her actions? What did her story say about the nature of slavery and resistance? Black communities largely celebrated her. White communities were more divided. Northern liberals saw her as a tragic figure driven to extremes. Southern apologists condemned her as proof that slaves were dangerous. Legal scholars noted that Elizabeth could never be prosecuted. The statute of limitations had passed. And even if it hadn't, Georgia would have had to extradite her from Pennsylvania, which had no interest in cooperating. The confession became ammunition for the growing civil rights movement. Frederick Douglass's sons cited it in speeches. Ida B. Wells mentioned it in anti-lynching campaigns. W.E.B. Du Bois referenced it in The Souls of Black Folk. Elizabeth Freeman had intended her story to be a quiet truth-telling. Instead, it became a rallying cry. She died on March 14, 1909, at age 78, in her Philadelphia home, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Her last words, reported by Grace, were, "I chose freedom." Never regret that. The Ashford Massacre had long-term impacts beyond Elizabeth's personal story. In Georgia, it became legend. Some versions claimed Elizabeth was a voodoo priestess who cursed the entire family. Others said she was an angel of vengeance sent by God. Still others insisted she was helped by dozens of slaves in a coordinated uprising. All versions agreed on the core truth. An enslaved woman destroyed her enslavers and escaped. For enslaved people across the South, the story was whispered proof that resistance was possible, that intelligence could defeat force, that planning and patience could overcome even the most absolute power. For slave owners, it was nightmare fuel. After August 1863, many wealthy families installed locks on bedroom doors, hired food tasters, lived in constant paranoia. Some stopped keeping beautiful enslaved women in the house. Others simply increased violence, trying to terrorize their property into submission. Neither approach worked. The system was dying. Elizabeth's story was just one small crack in the foundation, but cracks accumulate. 2 years later, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery entirely. In historical terms, Elizabeth Freeman's significance isn't that she killed 5 people. It's what her story represents about the hidden agency of enslaved people. Traditional narratives portrayed slaves as passive victims waiting for white saviors, abolitionists, politicians, union armies to grant them freedom. The truth is far more complex. Enslaved people resisted constantly, through work slowdowns, tool breaking, running away, poisoning, arson, and occasionally outright rebellion. Most of this resistance was hidden, disguised, deniable. You couldn't openly rebel in a system designed to crush rebellion through overwhelming force. But you could be strategic, patient, dangerous. Elizabeth Freeman was strategic. She waited 15 years, gathering knowledge, cultivating trust, planning meticulously. When she struck, it was surgical. 5 targets eliminated, evidence destroyed, escape successful. That takes intelligence and iron will. Her story also complicates our understanding of slavery's sexual violence. We tend to think of enslaved women's experiences in binary terms. Either they were violently raped or they were willing participants. But Elizabeth's relationship with Richard Ashford was neither. It was coerced consent, submission under threat, performed intimacy, survival dressed as affection. That gray area is where most enslaved women lived, and it's psychologically devastating in ways that simple violence isn't. Elizabeth had to pretend to care for the man who owned her children, pretend to enjoy sex with her rapist, pretend to be grateful for privileges that were just prettier chains. That's torture. And it's a torture specific to systems like slavery, where power is absolute, but likes to pretend it's something else. Modern parallels exist. Human trafficking, child marriage, abusive relationships where economic dependence creates pseudo-consent. Any situation where power imbalance is so extreme that choice becomes meaningless. Elizabeth Freeman's story speaks to all of that. She survived the unsurvivable. And when survival wasn't enough, she fought back with everything she had. Today, there's a small memorial to Elizabeth Freeman in Philadelphia's Eden Cemetery. It's simple. A granite stone with her name, dates 1831-1909, and a single line: she chose freedom. Her descendants, and there are many. Grace alone had 7 children, know the full story. Some have mixed feelings about their ancestors' actions. Others are fiercely proud. All agree that Elizabeth was extraordinary. In 2020, amid protests over police brutality and systemic racism, Elizabeth Freeman's story experienced a resurgence. Black activists pointed to her as an example of black resistance that history had tried to forget. Memes circulated: "Your great-great-grandmother didn't wait for permission to be free. She took it." Academic historians began reassessing her story not as a shocking anomaly, but as one example of countless acts of resistance we'll never know about. How many enslaved people poisoned their masters and got away with it? How many fires at plantations were actually arson? How many accidents weren't accidental? We'll never know the full count. But Elizabeth Freeman's story reminds us they existed. Resistance was constant, even when invisible. The ultimate question Elizabeth's story poses is this: when the law declares you subhuman, when it offers no protection and no recourse, when it allows others to rape you, enslave your children, and destroy your family, what is the moral response? Obedience, patience, nonviolence, prayer, or resistance by any means necessary? Elizabeth chose resistance. She chose her children over her enslavers' lives. She chose freedom over safety. She chose violence over submission. History continues to debate whether she was right. But she never doubted, and neither did her children who grew up free, or her grandchildren who never knew chains, or her great-great-great-grandchildren who live in a world where slavery is illegal, if not entirely extinct. The poison Elizabeth prepared in 1863 killed 5 people. But the freedom she claimed for her family freed hundreds of descendants. That's the calculation she made. And by her own accounting, she chose correctly. This is Elizabeth Freeman's story. Enslaved woman, secret mistress, mother, murderer, freedom fighter, survivor. She lived 32 years in chains and 44 years free. She killed 5 to save 3. She burned a plantation to ash and built a family in the ruins. She was not perfect. She was not nonviolent. She was not what history prefers its heroes to be, but she was free. And that, in the end, was all that mattered to her. May we all have her courage when chains, visible or invisible, threaten what we love most. May we all choose freedom, whatever the cost, and may we never forget that liberty was never given. It was always taken by people like Elizabeth Freeman, who decided death was preferable to one more day in bondage. Remember her name. Tell her story. Honor her choice because she chose freedom, and she never regretted that. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the hidden resistors of history, the women who fought back against impossible odds, the mothers who chose violence over seeing their children enslaved, then let your engagement show it. Leave your like if Elizabeth Freeman's story deserves to be remembered. Comment: was this justice or murder? What would you have done? Share, so others learn the history textbooks hide. Subscribe for more stories of resistance that America tried to forget. Elizabeth Freeman killed 5 people and freed 18. She lived to see her children educated, her grandchildren born free, and slavery abolished. She died at 78, never apologizing, never regretting. That's not a tragedy. That's a victory. And it's a story that deserves to be told again and again, until every person knows that enslaved people were not passive victims. They were strategic warriors who fought for freedom with whatever weapons they could find. This is history. Raw, brutal, and true. Remember Elizabeth Freeman. Remember Magnolia Grove. Remember that freedom has always been written in blood and fire.